Yeah, so forget about the title of the lecture, because I'm not going to talk anything about that stuff. I just thought, given the fact that we had a very good discussion the last couple of days, I think it's probably better to pull things together and to kind of maybe go through some of the themes and maybe look at it from a number of different lights. I think the one thing that's been, in a sense, the presupposition for a lot of the things that we've been considering is the fact that the concept of the self is inconceivable without the self feeling the need to assert itself, to find itself. And the reason why the self needs to assert itself or find itself is because it intuits, it clearly intuits the fact that it's estranged from itself and it's estranged from other people. And in many ways, alienation, in whatever form that you want to discuss it, is always in the background. It's always lurking in the background in any discussion of the whole idea of the self. And in many respects, people for a very, very long time have often understood that there is something, between them and the rest of the world. Just now we had a discussion on selfies, and I think one of the interesting points that perhaps we should consider about the selfie thing that's relevant to the fundamental aspects of what we're discussing is that the very moment when you take a selfie in the middle of a demonstration, I don't know if you gone on a demonstration recently, you see people taking pictures of themselves while ostensibly protesting, right? The very fact that you're taking a picture of yourself almost indicates, it almost becomes a statement of your alienation, that somehow the picture of yourself is actually more important than the cause that you are fighting for. There's a kind of, almost like a kind of very clear accommodation to your alienated state. And that's a very new development, because I think one of the fascinating and, in many respects, hopeful dimensions of human history has been this kind of unconscious struggle to settle accounts with your alienated self. People write about it, they try to overcome it, they try to find ways of neutralizing its sometimes very paralyzing effect. When people are worried about how they're seen, when people feel that maybe now and again they can, slip off their social mask. They don't need to kind of hide behind it all the time. There's a kind of long, important history in relation to that. And I think that one of the important kind of lessons that comes out of this experience, something that we need to recapitulate for the future, is the fact that that we don't have to simply reconcile ourselves to the self existing in that kind of distorted, limited way. We can try to change ourselves, and that self changing itself is really kind of critically important. And in many respects, one of the big differences between the way that the self is often sort of perceived, both historically and now, and a kind of more future-oriented one, is that we don't get obsessed with ourselves, but that rather we can think about a creative way in which we leave ourselves behind, ourselves as is kind of given to us, or as ourselves in the way that it's kind of assigned to us, and instead try to make ourselves to some extent. And we know that in the act of making ourselves needs to have some kind of external reference, some kind of external point that we're kind of relating to. I haven't got time to go into this, but one of the other missing aspect of the discussion is the relationship of the self to authority, because in the very moment that the self becomes authorized, you also have a sense of loss of any kind of external authority, and that becomes increasingly caricatured to the point at which, by the time you get to the 60s and the 70s, people say, I am the authority, and nobody else. I don't recognize any authority that's kind of beyond me, which is fine in one sense, because it gives you this kind of illusion of liberation, this illusion that somehow you're only accountable to yourself, you're not accountable to anybody else. But the problem with that is that in order to exercise and to give any meaning to that sort of aspiration for liberation, you do need to have some kind of authority outside of you, if for no other reason than because that is what can give you a degree of existential security. I mean, if we're simply floating around by ourselves and simply looking within us in terms of our own authoritative self, and there's nothing else, there's no kind of point of contact with any form of external reference point, then invariably, an element of insecurity and uncertainty will overwhelm our sense of self. And I think that's something that has been noticed in a number of different ways in recent sort of periods. Now, one of the important, so in that sense, you have to remember that authority provides a context for the self to be secure. And in many respects, insofar as the future has any kind of, the self has any kind of future in a kind of liberal humanist sense, it's also very much linked to a quest for a new kind of authority. I think the two go hand in hand. Something that I suppose we intuitively recognize in almost every debate that we have at the moment. I think the discussion, for example, on fake news, on what is truth, are all indirect recognition that our culture contests authority to the point at which even real and fake become sort of what divides those lines becomes increasingly more and more blurred. I would argue that a liberal humanist notion of the self relies on self-changing and also a commitment to live freely. I think the commitment to live freely is really quite important, and it's an ideal that is first developed by Aristotle in his idea of human flourishing, where, in a sense, it's in the act of living, choosing, and living freely that we become aware of what is good. We don't begin with a good person. We become good to basically making choices about life and through living freedom. And I think that idea of living freedom for ourselves in whatever modest or kind of immodest way we choose to do is really quite important. So human flourishing, which kind of recognizes that autonomy is both an end in itself, but also a means towards greater freedom and greater liberation, all kind of being encompassed together, is really the context within which we would like to see ourselves emerging and developing. Now, if you come back to alienation and the whole problem of alienation, there's been two important strategies developed to deal with it. And we discussed earlier on, for example, the search to find yourself through the impulse to find the authentic self, which is really one of the ways in which people have tried to overcome their alienation by basically getting rid of all the roadblocks that were sort of kind of established on your journey, on the way to in this journey on your way to yourself. Authenticity and looking for that became a very sort of persuasive way of dealing with this at a certain point in time, mainly the 18th century. But at the same time, alongside of that, what you also had was the realization that acting freely and acting in accordance with the principles of freedom through your autonomous self was possible, but not just possible, but necessary as a way of giving meaning to reason, rationality, and to kind of principles that all of humanity could kind of live by. And I think it's important to realize that these are historically specific moments. In the 18th century, I would say that both the search for authenticity and also the desire to be autonomous were on balance steps in the right direction. They really were moving in a way that had a kind of harmonious aspect to it. And its apologetic sort of passive side which would emerge later on, was still, relatively, sort of suppressed. And I think it's interesting if you, for example, if you go back to this discussion that was raised earlier on about Werther and Goethe's depiction of his kind of predicament. What is interesting about Goethe and the way that Werther deals with his alienation and the way that he's trying to be true to himself is very different than the way his 21st century equivalents go about doing it, because Werther didn't go out and ask for respect. He didn't go out and demanded affirmation. He wasn't saying, well, look at me, sort of, pity me, sort of, and accept me for what I am. He actually ended up, sort of, enacting a relatively heroic gesture. It was still a gesture, but a relatively heroic gesture by committing suicide. Because that was what he did. Now, committing suicide in order to make a point, even though it was a performative point, is actually not on par with taking a selfie, right? It's not on par with appearing wounded. Sort of there's something far more that was communicated through that experience. And if you look at the literature of the 18th century, and you got to look at the literature of the 18th century as almost like not just simply fiction, but almost like what you could call, if you were Foucault living in the 18th century, you would call the novels the technology of the self. That's really what you would call it, because for a lot of people, literature was a way, the novels were a way that they could, for the first time, sort of see the self for what it was. So that what was before intuited and hinted at, where you had this kind of traces of yourself that you were dying to express or to understand, through the novel, sort of gain meaning. I think one of the most interesting novels that was written, and because it was written by a philosopher that we already discussed, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was Julie, the Nouvelle Héloïse, New Héloïse. And it was one of those novels, epistolary novels, that were quite popular at the time, where essentially, a bit like in Werther, there's all these letters kind of being written, and Julie was having a very unconventional relationship, a triangular relationship, at a time when, so basic bourgeois forms of relationships are very stolid and very kind of limited. And some interesting books being written about the reception of the novel, the Nouvelle Héloïse, because what happened was that all of a sudden, sort of Rousseau got inundated by all these letters written mainly by women, but also a couple of men, basically saying, you wrote this novel and it's really about me. I mean, all the novels, all these people are saying, Jean-Jacques, is that really me you've captured in the novel? And they're asking, is this character, the main character, is that really you but pretending to be somebody else? And as far as they were concerned, the novel allowed them for the first time to begin to see themselves. And that was a very important moment in the 18th century where, I'm sure you already been aware of the discussion that has occurred in literary criticisms where the novels are seen as inextricably linked to the cultivation of the individual, and particularly the cultivation of the individual self, because the novel does provide a cultural medium through which that can occur. But what's really important about Nouvelle Héloïse and about Rousseau, is that the people involved in this kind of psychological drama of reacting to society to some extent, is that they are not just simply reacting to what's going on in society, they in their own ways are breaking with conventions. They're basically saying these conventions are ones we reject, but they don't just simply reject the conventions, they try to find an alternative way of conducting their lives. And in that sense, at that point in time, the attempt to find your true self, to find out who you are, has a very positive element. And I can really understand why Lukács, when he was writing about Goethe, sees and actually kind of praises the way in which these novelists managed to, sort of project a kind of a world that took individuals beyond where they were, and basically encouraged particularly young people to challenge themselves, not to be sort of subjects of social conventions, but much more authors of their destiny. So in that literature, there is still a connection between authorship and destiny. It's something that you kind of embrace for yourself. You take responsibility. Right? I mean, I think that's very important, because both Werther in Goethe and also so many of these other characters in the novel are actually taking responsibility for their lives. They might make really bad choices. I mean, suicide is not a good choice, but they are making choices, and they are living with its consequences. And I think it's quite important to understand that. I think looking at sort of what's really happening, and the way that the search for authenticity and the way that autonomy and the pursuit of autonomy evolves, you have two unpleasant consequences or unpleasant turns occurring. And I think the first thing that occurs is that bit by bit, and I think I touched on this yesterday, the concept of autonomy acquires an increasingly psychological form. Autonomy becomes increasingly sort of reframed and repackaged in a therapeutic kind of a way. So it becomes very much subject to a kind of therapeutic governance, and subject to sort of direction by people that are external to the individual who's trying to be autonomous. And you kind of finally get to a certain point where by the 1960s, one of the main sort of goals of certain forms of therapy is to ensure that the patient becomes autonomous, to kind of encourage and cultivate that autonomy. So it becomes a very different concept of autonomy that occurs. And I think what happens on the authenticity side is that it increasingly loses its romantic dimensions. You have to remember the romantic dimension, if you see it as a kind of full-blooded way, isn't just simply escapism. I mean, there is an element of escapism that's kind of contained within that, but there's also an element of basically, sort of trying to leap forward imaginatively, and there's a kind of imaginative side to that. And I think that there's a shift that occurs in the discussion of authenticity, a shift from an emphasis on the aesthetic side of it, and trying to find solutions to social problems in the domain of aesthetics, which, for all its limitations, at least sort of has the merit of creating great art and great literature, and providing other people with the artistic resources to sort of imagine different possibilities. There's a shift from aesthetics to psychology as well, a psychological turn occurring in that domain as well. And I think that what happens at a certain point is that the reaction to society, which is often sort of promoted through the search for authenticity, and the reaction to kind of social norms and social conventions, fundamentally mutate in a very destructive kind of a way. Because what happens is that originally, there's an idea that you're not particularly interested in the judgment of others. And because you're not interested in the judgment of others, you may well decide to develop a different code by which you're judged. Right? In other words, what you're saying is that you're rejecting the conventions that exist. You're not prepared to be judged, for example, by stolid bourgeois conventional norms. But you don't just stop there. What you're also saying is that there must be other criteria by which you can be judged and held to account and held responsible. And I think that's an okay way of proceeding. It's not necessarily my way forward, but it's got certain merits to it. You're assuming responsibility. And that shifts at a certain point from saying that you're not prepared to be judged by society and concluding with the fact that because you're not prepared to be judged by society, judgment itself is a bad thing. In other words, at a certain point, the refusal to put yourself to public scrutiny, the desire to shield yourself from criticism and to shield yourself from exposure to basically uncertainty, because that's really what you're kind of worried about and thinking about, at a certain point, that kind of becomes justified, not by saying that there's another criteria of judgment, but by saying that judgment itself is a reprehensible phenomenon. In other words, non-judgmentalism, then, which is one of the key values of Western societies, that we don't judge you. You can do whatever you want. You can be whatever you want. At that point, becomes critically important. And of course, what happens is that with non-judgmentalism, you basically sort of are finding an artificial way of resolving your problem of alienation by artificially ridding the world of uncertainty, of artificially ridding the world of risk, of artificially ridding the world of your own world of hurt and pain. And I think it's at that point that we come into the present moment, because in shielding yourself from the judgment of others, what you're saying is, accept me for what I am, right? Accept me for who I am. You're, in a sense, pleading or demanding that you quarantined, you kind of given this free, sort of safe space within which you could be yourself. And in many respects, what we're seeing in campus politics today is really the most grotesque version of that, something that actually exists in society beforehand and has been in the air for a very, very long time. I mean, the very moment that non-judgmentalism became a value you teach to children in schools, the very moment that in which non-judgmentalism trumps, the traditional values or trumps the values of the previous generation, and at the very moment at which what is a critical element of autonomy, which is judgment, you can't have autonomy without judgment, is now pathologized to a considerable extent. Oh, you are so judgmental, right? I mean, have you ever heard anybody say that? Oh, you are so judgmental. Well, thank God there are people who are prepared to be judgmental, because we recognize that being judgmental is the only way that we can communicate with each other. If you say something and I say, I kind of say, I don't say good or bad, but I say, then there is no dialogue, there is no conversation, there is no sociability anymore. But more important for our discussion, there is no autonomy. There is no scope for people freely making choices about other people's opinions or about other people's attributes. It becomes very much a kind of a free-for-all. So in that sense, what we have is a shift that occurs where the romantic idea of self-authorship, which is then taken seriously, is replaced by this weak, there is nothing to discover, all I can do possibly is get in touch with something that's like myself. That kind of development occurs, and and that's, I think, is seriously an important problem. So just to kind of reiterate, one point that I make is that there's a difference between rejecting a convention and rejecting society's judgment of you, because there's nothing really wrong with that. It's quite legitimate to reject social norms, social values, the way that society behaves, but then you're obliged to develop a different criteria by which you are judged. Now, all these developments that I'm kind of referring to lead to a notion of the self, which is almost defined by the fact that it's become estranged from choice. I mean, it's even estranged from that voyage of discovery that you have in Rousseau's novels, where you are trying to, sort of experiment. I mean, that's what the novels are doing. They're kind of experimenting, trying to find a way of getting to that non-alienated state where the self can be true to itself. All that kind of sort of element of choice and decision-making is really very, very, very much restricted. So what you have is a very interesting development, something that I'm working with at the moment, and I haven't actually hit the nail on the head, and maybe you can help me in relation to this, which is, at a certain point what happens is that the relationship between self and choice mutates into something quite dramatic, certainly in my opinion, because what you have is a self that's not developed through making choices about life, which is the way that creatively the self was seen as a changing self. But instead what you have is choice itself becomes almost like an act of consumption, and merely an act of consumption. And therefore what you have is the self doesn't choose between different sort of courses of action. The self doesn't choose the making of decisions that are difficult and are by inherently raise issues about uncertainty and risk. Instead, what you do is you choose the self. In other words, what you do is you're not choosing how yourself is going to make decisions of either a normative character or about fundamental issues to do with life. Instead of allowing yourself out on the battlefield of life, dealing with uncertainty and making choices, you choose a self, right? And I think that's to me the interesting kind of development. In other words, it's much easier to choose a self, a different self than who you are, not the self I want to be, but a different self. It's much more attractive than putting yourself out on the line and testing yourself and developing yourself in relation to these different circumstances. And in the act of choosing yourself, what you're choosing is an identity. Right? It's a consumption-led identity, because when you say, I identify as this, that's the choice you're making is I identify as this particular type of person living this particular lifestyle. Right? So the choice becomes the identity rather than the self choosing for itself between different options and deciding what is the way that it can develop in accordance with its own inner nature and with its inclinations. Because one of the important elements in the exercise of autonomy is you encourage people to act in accordance with the way they will. I think that in that sense, the Mill's notion of autonomy is more suggestive than the Kantian one, because it's not really about some preconceived sort of sensibility that you're expressing through being autonomous, but it's much more a recognition that it's being who you are in action that will result in the realization of the positive potential of autonomy. So basically, in a sense, what I'm trying to suggest is what we now have as an important development is that as the self becomes increasingly passive and estranged from choice-making and regards autonomy skeptically, if not cynically, as that begins to occur, then increasingly, the self attempts to find some reason for its existence in choosing a different self, and that's the heroic moment. The heroic moment becomes choosing a self, an identity, rather than the mundane task of choice-making in the course of everyday existence. In other words, what you are doing is buying a new social mask. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. You go down to the shop, and you purchase, metaphorically, of course, a new social mask, which you put on your face, and that's who you are from that particular point onwards. And in that sense, what you're doing is you're seeking acceptance, you're demanding acceptance on demand, without putting in the work that usually involves the struggle to confront the alienated state within which we live. Now, just finally, I think that this discussion is very difficult, and is very, at times, quite confusing. And the reason why that is because when we come to the domain of autonomy, it's not a black and white thing. I think that in this room, the kind of people that we are, we could probably all agree on the fact that, when we assert the superiority of autonomy, we do that because we recognize that there's some inherent moral value in the act of self-determination, and there's a moral value just in the very act of making choices. And the reason why we say that is because we understand that it's in the course of choosing that we become exposed to the kind of experiences where our moral imagination is both tested and nourished at the same time. You don't develop your autonomous self without exposing yourself to that kind of particular experience. But what's really important for us is to engage in that. And I think the reason why this is a very difficult discussion is because at the moment, although a lot of people might make fun of those individuals who go out and buy their identity, or say, I identify as something, and it can be very humorous to make fun of their language and the vocabulary and all the artifacts that are invented around it. We can have a lot of giggles about it. Many of these people who do that are at the same time unable or are reluctant to take autonomy seriously themselves. They are unable and unwilling to do that because to be consistently for choice, to be consistently a self-determining individual, is at the very least tiring. I mean, it is not easy to get up in the morning, brush your teeth, and make many, many free choices after that. After I've freely chosen, to make sure that I have a fresh breath rather than anything else, most of us would rather at that point allow other people to make choices for us, or be spared of the burden and the responsibility that involves. And I really think that is something that some people have understood. I think the existentialists understood that. That's probably their main merit. And I think that in the past, certain sections of revolutionary movements have understood how the act of will was important. But it's interesting that even within Marxism, even in the Marxist tradition, there's a visceral reaction against being consistently self-determining. I think if you reread Lukács's Destruction of Reason, you will find that within that text he's phenomenally hostile to what he calls vitalism. I don't know if you recall some of those kind of passages. And I think I can understand that because most vitalists were pretty rational, very kind of mystical kind of people. But very often what he's really reacting to is that kind of sense of voluntaristic desire to to kind of determine, to take matters into their own hand, that kind of element. And you can criticize them for doing that, because you can say it's not possible for you as an individual to determine your future. And that's, of course, in one sense, that's right. That's why this is a difficult discussion. But unless we all make an attempt to choose, right, we might not realize the object of our choice, but nevertheless, unless we make the act of choice our own and test ourselves in that basic process, then we basically end up in the kind of intellectual and cultural and political status that we're living in. So I just want to end up by arguing that at the end of the day, the really important sort of lesson for me is to see the balanced way that our attempt to overcome alienation has occurred in the past, and to suggest to ourselves that although we live in a world that is a little bit hostile to the struggle against alienation, very accommodationist in many, many respects, we still have sort of one weapon that any of us in this room can wield, which is our capacity to make choices and to live with the consequences of those choices, and to test out our spirit, and to test out our imagination, and to develop it through that process. Thanks.